Hunter Brooks was just an aircraft maintenance inspector nobody paid attention to in a terminal crowded with thousands of travelers. When Chief Executive Officer Grace Whitmore ordered him to kneel and apologize in front of the entire staff for refusing to sign off on the safety of an international flight, dozens of phones rose at once to record the humiliation. Hunter quietly removed his certification badge, said only one sentence, and walked away. From this moment forward, he told her, not a single aircraft belonging to this airline would be permitted to take off. Within minutes, the entire airport descended into chaos. If you enjoy dramatic reversals and justice finally winning, stay until the very end of this story. The airport sprawled across acres of concrete and glass, a small city unto itself where hundreds of flights departed and arrived every single day, carrying passengers toward reunions, business deals, vacations, and grief they did not yet know was coming. Grace Whitmore had been celebrated across the industry as the youngest chief executive ever to run a major American airline, a woman who had climbed from junior analyst to the corner office in barely a decade through sheer force of will and an instinct for cutting costs that shareholders adored. She wore her authority like armor, moved through the building surrounded by assistants, and rarely slowed down long enough to notice the people who kept her planes running. Behind her polished confidence sat a mounting pressure that few employees ever saw, a board of directors demanding higher quarterly returns, investors threatening to pull support, and a fragile public image that depended entirely on flights departing exactly on schedule. Every delay cost money, every canceled route cost trust. And in an industry where margins were razor thin, Grace had convinced herself that hesitation was the only true enemy. Hunter moved through the same building in a manner so unremarkable that most employees could not have described his face if asked. He wore a plain company jacket, carried a battered clipboard, and spent his mornings crouched beneath landing gear or running diagnostic scans nobody else bothered to double-check. To the younger technicians, he was simply the difficult old-timer who slowed down inspections and asked too many questions, a man whose exacting standards occasionally delayed a pushback by 20 or 30 minutes. None of them knew that 4 years earlier he had carried a federal badge, that he had once walked through the wreckage of crashed airliners searching for the small mechanical failure that explained why 40 or 180 people never came home. None of them knew that after his wife died in a car accident, he had walked away from that career entirely, choosing instead the quieter, steadier work of keeping planes safe on the ground so he could be present each evening for his young daughter, Lily. Every morning before his shift, Hunter dropped Lily at school himself, a small ritual that grounded him more than any paycheck ever could, and every evening he made sure to be home in time to sit across from her at the dinner table, rather than somewhere on the other side of the country picking through debris. His coworkers occasionally noticed the faded outline of a wedding ring he no longer wore and assumed, correctly, that there was a story there, but nobody ever asked and he never offered. He kept a single photograph of his late wife tucked inside his locker, visible only to him, a quiet reminder of exactly why he had traded a career of national significance for one that let him tuck his daughter into bed at a reasonable hour. He never spoke of the past. He simply did the work carefully the way he always had, because somewhere along the way he had learned that carelessness was the difference between an uneventful Tuesday and a funeral, and he had buried too many strangers' loved ones to ever forget that lesson. On the morning everything changed, Hunter was assigned to close out the maintenance record on a Boeing aircraft, scheduled for an international departure that afternoon, a flight already sold out and heavily promoted in the airline's advertising as the flagship route of the new season. Connor Blake, the airline's chief operating officer, had been quietly pressuring the maintenance department for 2 full days to release the aircraft ahead of schedule, citing contractual penalties tied to a codeshare partner and warning that further delay would jeopardize a lucrative international agreement. Connor was a man who measured success entirely in numbers on a spreadsheet, and to him, an aircraft parked in a hangar was nothing more than lost revenue accumulating by the hour. He had already told 2 junior technicians the paperwork was essentially finished and needed only a signature to close the file. Hunter examined the aircraft as he always did, methodically, without hurry, running his hands along the landing gear assembly and cross-referencing the sensor logs against the physical inspection sheets. What he found stopped him cold. There was a hairline crack forming along the landing gear strut, subtle enough that a rushed inspection would have missed it entirely, but unmistakable to someone who had spent years studying exactly this kind of failure in wreckage investigations. The sensor data attached to the maintenance file had been altered, smoothing out irregular readings that should have triggered an automatic flag. The maintenance records themselves did not match the actual repair history logged in the hangar's internal system, as though someone had gone back and quietly rewritten the story of what repairs had actually taken place. Hunter did not raise his voice and did not report the discrepancy to anyone beyond the required channel. He simply refused to sign the release, marked the aircraft as grounded pending further inspection, and returned the paperwork to the front desk exactly as procedure demanded. Word reached Connor within the hour, and his reaction was immediate and furious, because in his mind a signature was a formality standing between the company and millions of dollars in penalties, not a judgment about whether an aircraft carrying hundreds of human beings was actually safe to fly. Connor stormed down to the hangar himself, his tie already loosened, his voice already rising before he reached the maintenance bay. He accused Hunter of manufacturing problems out of stubbornness, of holding the entire operation hostage over what he called a minor cosmetic flaw, and warned that this kind of obstruction would not be tolerated. Hunter calmly repeated that the crack was structural, that the sensor data had been tampered with, and that no inspector with any integrity would release that aircraft in its current condition. Connor did not want facts, he wanted the signature. Within minutes he was on the phone summoning Grace Whitmore down to the hangar personally, framing the situation as a rogue employee sabotaging a flight worth millions in contractual obligations, and by the time Grace arrived, the story Connor had built in her mind bore almost no resemblance to what had actually happened. Grace walked into the hangar already primed for confrontation, flanked by 2 assistants and trailed by a small cluster of curious employees who had heard rumors spreading through the building that something dramatic was unfolding. Connor met her at the entrance and immediately began speaking before she could ask a single question of her own, painting Hunter as a difficult employee who had a documented history of causing delays, who was now willfully endangering a critical international partnership out of nothing more than obstinance. He mentioned the penalty clauses. He mentioned the shareholders. He mentioned pointedly that this single delay could cost the company more than $4 million if the codeshare agreement collapsed. Grace, exhausted from 3 consecutive board meetings and already anxious about upcoming earnings calls, absorbed every word without once asking to see the actual inspection report sitting untouched in a folder on a nearby desk. She found Hunter standing quietly beside the aircraft, unbothered by the small crowd gathering around them, his posture calm in a way that some in the room mistook for arrogance rather than the steadiness of a man who had faced far worse than an angry executive. Grace demanded to know why he believed his judgment outweighed the operational needs of the entire company. Hunter answered simply that the aircraft was not safe to fly and that he would not sign anything suggesting otherwise. Connor interjected loudly, insisting this was insubordination dressed up as caution, and the small crowd of onlookers, sensing conflict, began quietly lifting their phones to record whatever was about to happen. Grace felt every eye in the hangar on her, felt the pressure of the board, the shareholders, and the codeshare partner all compressed into this single moment, and something in her calculating mind decided that a public display of authority was the fastest way to end the standoff and reassert control. She told Hunter that he had 2 choices in front of everyone watching. He could kneel down, apologize publicly for defying company procedure, and sign the release immediately, or he could consider himself terminated on the spot. The words landed in the hangar like a physical blow, and the air itself seemed to tighten. Somewhere in the gathered crowd someone gasped audibly, while dozens of phone screens glowed as recordings began. Hunter did not move. He did not raise his voice, did not argue, did not so much as blink under the weight of her ultimatum, and his stillness unsettled people far more than shouting would have. Grace, unused to being ignored, began counting down aloud, her voice sharpening with each passing second as though sheer willpower alone might force him to comply. 10 seconds passed, then 20. The silence stretched painfully, broken only by the distant hum of ground equipment and the nervous shuffling of employees who had never imagined they would witness something like this unfolding in their own workplace. When Grace reached the final count, Hunter finally moved, though not in the direction anyone expected. He reached calmly into his jacket, removed his laminated technical credential and his signing authority badge, and set them down on a nearby toolbox with the same unhurried precision he brought to every inspection he had ever performed. Then he looked directly at Grace, his voice quiet but perfectly clear across the silent hangar, and told her that effective immediately, the airline no longer employed anyone certified to authorize this particular aircraft for flight. A ripple of nervous laughter moved through parts of the crowd, several employees assuming this was simply a dramatic bluff meant to save face on his way out the door. Grace herself laughed under her breath, dismissing the statement as empty theater from a man who had just lost his job, and turned to walk away without asking a single question about what his credential actually authorized. Hunter picked up his bag, said nothing further, and walked out of the hangar into the ordinary bustle of the terminal beyond, leaving behind a room that had no idea what had actually just happened. Barely 12 minutes later, the airline's Central Operations Center registered the first anomaly. The maintenance release system flagged the Boeing aircraft as lacking a valid signing authority, an automated safeguard tied directly into the Federal Aviation Administration's digital compliance network, and without a certified signature on file, the aircraft was automatically locked out of pushback clearance. A duty manager assumed it was a simple software glitch and attempted to manually override the block, only to discover the override required the same missing credential. Ground crew radioed the gate to hold the aircraft in place while technicians investigated, unaware that the very same lockout was about to cascade far beyond a single flight. Within the hour, a second aircraft scheduled for departure returned the identical error, its maintenance file also awaiting final certification that no remaining staff member was authorized to provide. Then came a third, and a fourth, each one tracing back to sign-off authorities that existed on paper but had, in practice, quietly deferred every complex certification to Hunter for years without anyone in leadership noticing how completely the system depended on him. The operations center, initially treating this as an isolated technical fault, slowly began to realize they were staring at something closer to a systemic collapse. Screens across the control room filled with red flags, supervisors paced behind rows of monitors making increasingly frantic phone calls. What had begun as a single grounded aircraft was rapidly becoming an airline unable to fly any of its planes. Out in the terminal, the consequences arrived far more visibly and far less patiently. Departure boards froze mid-update. Gate agents were forced to announce delay after delay with no real explanation to offer, and the low simmering frustration common to any crowded airport began boiling over into something louder and angrier. Passengers who had connections to catch, weddings to attend, and business meetings scheduled across the ocean pressed toward customer service counters, demanding answers nobody could give them. Some filmed the chaos and uploaded it in real time, unknowingly linking these furious crowds to the very same footage of Hunter's public humiliation that had already begun circulating from phones inside the hangar. Within the space of a single afternoon, two separate storms were converging into one, and the airline had lost control of both. Connor, still unwilling to accept what was happening, insisted repeatedly to Grace and to the increasingly panicked operations team that this was nothing more than a software malfunction that the Information Technology Department would resolve within the hour. He refused to acknowledge any connection between the lockout and Hunter's departure, dismissing the possibility as absurd, even as engineers working directly on the compliance system began telling him otherwise. Grace, watching flight after flight pile up on the tarmac while gate agents fielded a rising tide of furious travelers, felt her earlier confidence begin to crack. She ordered the information technology team to bypass the certification requirement entirely, only to be told bluntly that doing so would violate federal aviation regulations and risk the airline's operating certificate altogether. There was no shortcut. There was no override. There was only the truth Hunter had stated plainly in the hangar, and that almost no one had bothered to actually verify before mocking him for saying it. It was the head of the operations center, working late into the afternoon trying to untangle the cascading failure, who finally pulled Hunter's personnel file and delivered the news that silenced the entire executive floor. Hunter Brooks, the quiet man mocked as a difficult technician just hours earlier, held the highest level of signing authority the airline possessed, a designation granted by federal aviation regulators themselves and rarely issued to any individual anywhere in the industry. For years, without fanfare or acknowledgement, every complex certification across the fleet had ultimately traced back to his credential, an arrangement leadership had allowed to continue because it was convenient and cost-effective, never once considering what would happen if that single point of failure simply walked away. There was no backup. There had never needed to be one because nobody imagined the day would come when they would drive him out the door themselves. The deeper details emerged slowly across the executive team like water rising through cracks in a foundation nobody had bothered to inspect. Hunter had spent nearly a decade as a federal accident investigator, called to the wreckage of some of the most catastrophic aviation failures in recent memory, tasked with determining the precise mechanical or procedural failure that had cost dozens or hundreds of lives in a matter of seconds. He had personally helped rewrite portions of the inspection protocol the entire industry now used as standard practice. Protocols built directly from lessons learned crouched inside burned fuselages and scattered wreckage fields. After his wife's death left him a single father overnight, he had quietly stepped back from that grueling, travel-heavy career and taken the maintenance inspector position specifically because it let him be home for dinner with his daughter each night. He had never once mentioned any of this to his coworkers, not out of secrecy, but because he had simply wanted for once to be an ordinary man doing ordinary work. Connor's response to this revelation was not humility but desperation, and he doubled down harder than ever, insisting to anyone who would listen that Hunter had orchestrated the entire crisis deliberately as some elaborate act of revenge against a company he secretly resented. He suggested to Grace, in increasingly urgent tones, that the grounding was a manufactured emergency, that the crack in the landing gear was minor and exaggerated, and that the fastest path back to normal operations was discrediting Hunter publicly before the story spiraled further out of control. For the first time since the confrontation began, Grace found herself genuinely uncertain who to believe, and that uncertainty, small as it was, marked the very first crack in the version of events Connor had built for her from the beginning. Federal aviation regulators did not wait for the airline to sort out its internal confusion, because an automated compliance flag of this magnitude triggered an immediate response protocol on its own. Regional Director Daniel Reyes arrived personally with a team of inspectors before the sun had fully set, treating the grounded aircraft not as a public relations inconvenience but as a genuine safety matter requiring full documentation. The aircraft was formally sealed pending investigation, its maintenance history pulled in its entirety, and every technician who had touched the plane in recent weeks was scheduled for individual interviews. What the inspectors found over the following hours only confirmed what Hunter had identified within minutes using nothing more than his own eyes and years of hard-earned experience. The crack along the landing gear strut was real, measurable, and precisely where structural fatigue would be expected to develop under repeated stress cycles the aircraft had quietly exceeded. A component replaced during a recent repair did not match the specifications required for that particular aircraft model, a substitution that should never have passed any competent inspection. The maintenance logs, when cross-referenced against actual technician time cards and hangar security footage, revealed clear evidence that portions of the repair history had been altered after the fact to make an incomplete job appear finished. Had the aircraft taken off as scheduled, the combination of structural fatigue and improper components created a real and serious risk of landing gear failure, the exact category of catastrophic mechanical event Hunter had spent years of his life investigating in the aftermath rather than the moments before. Daniel Reyes himself pulled Hunter aside privately during the second day of the investigation, recognizing his name the moment it appeared in the personnel file, and the two men spoke for nearly an hour in a quiet corner of the hangar away from cameras and executives alike. Daniel had worked alongside Hunter years earlier on a separate investigation into a regional carrier crash, and he remembered clearly how meticulous Hunter had always been, how he refused to sign off on a final report until every possible explanation had been exhausted. He told Hunter plainly that the industry had lost something valuable the day he left federal service, and that watching him get humiliated over exactly the kind of judgment call that had once saved countless lives felt like a betrayal of everything the profession was supposed to stand for. Hunter simply nodded, unwilling to dwell on the compliment, and returned his attention to the documentation in front of him, more concerned with finishing the investigation properly than with any vindication it might bring him personally. Connor's desperation escalated as the federal investigation closed in around him, and he began making choices that would ultimately seal his own fate far more effectively than anything Hunter had said in the hangar. He attempted to quietly delete portions of the digital maintenance logs late one evening, unaware that federal investigators had already secured backup copies the moment the aircraft was sealed. He pressured a junior technician named Marcus, the young man who had originally performed the improper repair under Connor's direct instruction, warning him that his career would be destroyed if he spoke a single word to investigators. Marcus, barely 26 years old and terrified of losing the only job supporting his young family, spent 2 sleepless nights wrestling with his conscience before finally deciding that a paycheck was not worth hundreds of lives. He walked into Daniel Reyes's temporary office at the airport and told investigators everything, describing in detail how Connor had instructed him to complete the repair quickly using whatever parts were available, and how he had later been told to adjust the paperwork to reflect a job that had never actually been finished properly. Grace, meanwhile, had begun her own quiet reckoning far from the cameras and the chaos of the terminal. Alone in her office that evening, she finally sat down and reviewed the security footage from the hangar in full, watching not just the moment of confrontation but everything leading up to it, the urgent phone calls, the selective information Connor had fed her in the hours before she ever arrived on scene. She noticed, on a second viewing, how carefully Connor had avoided ever mentioning the specific safety findings, how he had spoken only in terms of contracts, penalties, and deadlines, never once addressing whether the aircraft was actually safe to fly. She pulled the original inspection report Hunter had filed and read it slowly from beginning to end, this time without anyone standing over her shoulder rushing her toward a decision. The technical language was precise, cautious, and utterly devoid of the vindictive obstinance Connor had described. It read exactly like what it was, the careful judgment of a man who understood better than anyone in the building what was actually at stake. The realization settled over Grace slowly and painfully, the understanding that she had allowed herself to become an instrument in someone else's cover-up, that her own hunger to appear decisive under pressure had led her to publicly humiliate the one person in the entire organization who had actually been protecting the passengers who trusted the airline with their lives. She thought about the phones raised in the hangar, the countdown she had spoken aloud, the ultimatum she had delivered without asking a single question first. Shame was not an emotion Grace experienced often, insulated as she typically was by titles and authority, but it arrived now with a weight she could not talk her way around. Late that night, she drove to the address listed in Hunter's personnel file, sat outside for nearly 20 minutes, gathering the courage to knock, and finally did. Hunter opened the door in a plain sweater, his daughter Lily's cartoons faintly audible from another room, and regarded Grace with neither hostility nor warmth, simply a calm attentiveness that somehow made the moment feel heavier than if he had shouted. Grace did not offer excuses. She told him plainly that she had failed to verify the facts before acting, that she had let pressure and pride override basic judgment, and that regardless of what happened next in the investigation, she owed him a genuine apology rather than a calculated public relations gesture. Hunter listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he said only that an aircraft does not forgive arrogance, that mechanical failure does not care how confident the person signing the paperwork happened to be. Grace absorbed the words in silence, and for the first time since this entire ordeal began, she said nothing in response at all, because for once there was genuinely nothing adequate to say. Connor, sensing the ground shifting beneath him, made one final desperate attempt to control the narrative before it slipped entirely out of his hands. He retained an aggressive attorney and began quietly briefing select reporters, framing himself as a loyal executive scapegoated by a disgruntled former federal employee with an axe to grind against the industry that had once employed him. He suggested publicly that Hunter had exaggerated the safety findings to seek attention or leverage a lawsuit, and for a brief moment a handful of headlines picked up the story exactly as Connor had shaped it, but the evidence accumulating against him was no longer something spin could contain. The hangar's own security cameras had captured him pressuring Marcus. Internal emails recovered from company servers showed him explicitly instructing staff to expedite the aircraft despite unresolved technical concerns. Digital signature logs proved someone had accessed and altered the maintenance file using Connor's own credentials in the hours before Hunter's inspection. Marcus's sworn statement to federal investigators corroborated every piece of it in painstaking detail. Piece by piece, the version of events Connor had spent days constructing collapsed under the sheer weight of documentation nobody had thought to hide well enough. The airline's board of directors convened an emergency session within the week, summoned by chairwoman Margaret Kessler, a woman who had built her own reputation on decades of careful, unglamorous diligence and who viewed the unfolding crisis with the particular fury reserved for leadership that had nearly destroyed everything she had spent years helping build. Grace stood before the board and did something few executives in her position ever willingly do. She took full public responsibility without qualification, describing plainly how she had allowed pressure and ego to override basic verification, how she had humiliated an employee whose judgment had ultimately saved the airline from a catastrophe that could have ended lives and the company itself in a single afternoon. Connor was questioned separately and offered a defense riddled with contradictions that even his own attorney struggled to reconcile. Daniel Reyes presented the federal findings in full methodical detail, laying out the falsified records, the improper component, and the structural crack that investigators agreed would very likely have led to landing gear failure had the aircraft departed as originally scheduled. The shareholders present, informed in real time of exactly how close the airline had come to a preventable disaster, reacted with an anger that made the earlier hangar confrontation look almost tame by comparison. Connor was suspended from all duties before the meeting concluded and formally terminated within days, with the board voting unanimously to refer the entire matter to federal prosecutors for criminal review, given the deliberate falsification of safety records. Word of the referral spread quickly through the industry, and within it Connor's professional reputation, built over nearly 15 years, effectively ceased to exist overnight. Other carriers quietly distanced themselves from any association with him, and the executive recruiters who had once courted him aggressively stopped returning his calls entirely. Grace, by contrast, was permitted by the board to remain in her position, but only on the explicit condition that she personally lead a complete restructuring of the airline's safety culture from the ground up, beginning with the very department she had so publicly disrespected weeks earlier. Margaret Kessler made clear to her privately, after the formal session concluded, that this second chance was not being extended out of sympathy but because the board had watched her take responsibility without flinching, a rarer quality among executives than anyone in that boardroom cared to admit. Robert Hayes, the company's lead attorney, spent the following weeks drafting an entirely new whistleblower protection policy at Grace's direct instruction, one that legal counsel across the industry would later study as a model for how a company might rebuild trust after nearly losing it completely. Grace called for a company-wide gathering held in the very same hangar where the confrontation had first unfolded, choosing the location deliberately rather than avoiding it. Employees packed the space shoulder to shoulder, many of them holding the same phones that had once recorded Hunter's humiliation, though this time nobody raised them expecting spectacle. Grace stood in almost the exact spot where she had once issued her ultimatum and spoke without notes, without spin, and without a single mention of public relations strategy. She apologized to Hunter by name in front of the entire staff, describing precisely what she had gotten wrong and why, refusing to soften the account or shift blame elsewhere the way so many executives instinctively do when a camera is present. She did not frame the apology as a gesture for the cameras circulating online, but as something owed simply because it was true and because Hunter had earned nothing less. Hunter, standing near the back of the crowd rather than at the front where Grace had gestured for him to join her, offered only a brief response when she insisted he speak. He said that a sincere apology delivered at the right moment carries more weight than any amount of authority a title can provide, and that titles in the end mean very little if the person holding one is unwilling to admit when they are wrong. It was a small statement, delivered without dramatics, but the room absorbed it in complete silence before the applause began, spreading from the back rows forward until the entire hangar was on its feet. Employees who had spent years walking past Hunter without a second glance now understanding exactly who had been quietly protecting them all along. 3 months later, the airline looked meaningfully different from the one that had nearly grounded itself into catastrophe over a single afternoon. Hunter accepted a newly created executive position, Director of Flight Safety, a role built specifically around his federal investigative background and designed to ensure no single point of failure like the one nearly missed would ever again go unnoticed by leadership. Grace personally rebuilt significant portions of the company's internal culture, implementing new protections explicitly guaranteeing that employees who raised safety concerns would never again face retaliation or public pressure, alongside a fully transparent reporting system that made falsifying a maintenance record substantially more difficult than it had ever been before. Marcus, the young technician whose honesty had ultimately cracked the entire cover-up wide open, was formally commended rather than punished, and kept his position with a renewed sense of purpose he had not expected to find in the aftermath of nearly losing everything. Connor faced formal prosecution for falsifying federal safety records, a legal process that would occupy him for years to come and effectively end any possibility of returning to an industry that no longer trusted his name in any capacity. The airline itself slowly rebuilt the public trust it had so nearly shattered, its recovery driven less by advertising than by a genuine visible shift in how it treated the people responsible for keeping its aircraft safe. On the day the airline unveiled a new flight safety training center built specifically around lessons drawn from Hunter's decades of investigative experience, Grace personally invited him to stand beside her at the ceremony rather than remain quietly in the background as he preferred. The two of them stood together near the tarmac as the sun dropped low over the horizon, watching a line of aircraft lift off one after another into clear evening sky. Their relationship settled now into something built patiently on respect and earned trust rather than any hurried declaration neither of them was in any rush to make. No title, however powerful, outweighs the responsibility a person carries for the safety of another human life. Authority can force people to their heads out of fear, but only genuine integrity earns the kind of respect that lasts. A single difficult decision, even one that risks an entire career, can still be the decision that saves hundreds of lives and ultimately reshapes an entire organization for the better. Often it is the person most easily overlooked who has quietly been holding everyone else's safety in their hands all along.